For many people on this call, you've watched as the whole culture of our country has changed. I mean, when I was a young boy, the whole the whole country had a pretty much of a shared culture. There were problems to be certain, but the the people looked after one another, and this was whether you were dealing within the black culture or the white culture, or the Italians or the Irish or whomever. There's no question there were divisions, and there's no question that there was segregation, and there's no question that there was discrimination at that time. But within each group, faith in God was absolutely critical to that group. And as a nation, we even got to the point in the mid 50s on Flag Day in 1956 of adding um, to the Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God. And so that was a shared viewpoint. That was not controversial in the least. Today, I would suggest to you that there is no way that that might be passed through any legislative body in this nation. The nation has wandered. We have sown the wind, and we are now reaping the whirlwind. You're familiar undoubtedly with the analogy of the frog in the boiling water, that if you start heating the water slowly, the frog does not jump out and eventually is killed. A day comes in the life of a nation when, according to Scripture, God removes his restraining hand. The nation is then free to choose its own destiny, to destroy itself, and to collapse. But one or two can save a city, and a large group, if they turn from their own sin, can save a nation. The leader of a city and the leader of a nation are each like the rudder on a ship. Whichever way he or she goes will determine the people's fate. And we have seen that in spades over the past several weeks. But the leader's heart is held in God's hand. The heart of the people determine the heart of its leaders, because that is how God votes, based on us. And so have we reached that day where God has removed his restraining hand? The scriptures say the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life. So it holds out that choice, knowing that there is a gift to come. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man. He spoke with Noah, and he said, the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. And the Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And so it was God's plan to rebuild. Genesis 6. In Romans 1, we read about the decline of a nation, and we read how God, at some point, may choose to remove his restraining hand. For although they knew God, we read, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile. Their foolish hearts were darkened. And although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. So we see that the indication of God removing his hand or beginning to remove his hand is letting people do whatever they want. It's as if he has said, well, you didn't want to follow me. You didn't want to trust me. You didn't want me involved in your life. You didn't want me involved in the decisions that you are making. You didn't want me involved in your government. You didn't want me involved in your school. You didn't want me involved in the way that you structure your marriage. You didn't want me involved in the way that you raise your children. I will just back off, and you can do whatever you want. If you want to have drag queen story hour, you can do that. You can do whatever you want. And it says even their women exchange natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind so that they do what ought not to be done. Basically, they do the things that ultimately hurt themselves. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. And although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. Has our nation gotten to that point? Well, today, as Larry mentioned earlier, we are seeing anarchy across this nation. Seattle has been making big news in the last couple of days. The picture shows Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. This is a section of Seattle, Washington, that has been declared police-free. It's a cop-free zone. And the people are policing themselves, not necessarily the people who live there, but rather what emerged on Tuesday is that police ceded the entire neighborhood to Antifa and Black Lives Matter, whose representatives barricaded a large segment of the Capitol Hill neighborhood, and they declared the area this autonomous community, separate from Seattle itself, and not under the laws of Seattle or the laws of the United States of America. The next thing that occurred was thousands of leftist protesters led by Black Lives Matter and Antifa entered City Hall shortly after midnight on Wednesday and demanded that the mayor, who was a Democrat, by the way, resign. Some of their demands were end imprisonment, reintroduce segregation, ban police, and these were really cartoonish demands. And clearly, as you go through the long list of demands, there is no expectation that they will be met. But what you see is that this is a test. And other revolutionaries throughout the country are watching to see what happens and how this gets treated. And so it's no surprise that the president immediately called for the taking back of this area by the governor of the state of Washington. Now, what has happened in the past few weeks is horrible. An evil and despicable act, a murder by one man, Derek Chauvin, has unleashed the demons of hell, very literally. Everybody has to condemn this murder. But there is a bit more to the story. It does not appear that Derek Chauvin and George Floyd were unknown to one another. Rather, they worked together for some time. Houston Police Chief Art Acevedo suggested that former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin may have had a personal motivation when he knelt on George Floyd's neck. And he urged investigators to examine the relationship between both men very closely. You see, both worked as security guards at the same Latin nightclub as recently as last year. El Nuevo Rodeo, the 38th Precinct, that's the nightclub, the 38th Precinct, which is the precinct that Chauvin was from, and Cup Foods, which is the store where George Floyd allegedly passed a counterfeit bill, are within a few blocks of one another. The Mexican club is relatively small, and so there's no question that the two would have known one another. So there's something more going on, not just black and white. division. But what we do see is that America is fracturing. The call is get the National Guard out of the cities. Antifa and Black Lives Matter are working to improve America. Looting is spoken of by people who in the past you would have thought would never say such a thing. It is spoken of as just another form of protest. The NFL is now saying that they should side with the protesters. Major corporations like Amazon are donating millions to Black Lives Matter and emblazoning it across their website. Amazon alone donated 10 million to BLM. And then there are the cries throughout the country to defund the police. It's coming from protesters, from celebrities, from politicians. The Babylon Bee is a satirical press organ, and here's their account. Congressional Democrats have announced a proposal to abolish the police and replace them all with traveling bands of hippies singing John Lennon's classic song, Imagine. The police forces will arrive at the scene of a crime, pull out their djembes and guitars, and start singing beautiful lines like, imagine there's no heaven, it's easy if you try. Criminals are expected to begin weeping as soon as they see the peace, love, and tolerance displayed by the hippies. Our early research has been very promising, said Rain Windflower, head of hippie research in the city of Minneapolis. The science seems to indicate that as soon as you approach someone who is breaking the law and start singing, imagine all the people living for today, they drop their deadly weapon, return all the goods they have stolen, and join us in a dancing circle to smoke some weed. Okay, well, obviously that is satire. That is not what is happening. The reality is far worse because it's not just the anarchists in Seattle. Minneapolis City Council members intend to defund and dismantle the city's police department. That was in CNN on Monday. Well, what you need to know is this is a Marxist strategy. The Bolsheviks, for example, attacked existing police forces just prior to the revolution in Russia. And once in power, they established their own secret police. The Cheka was formed in 1917 and given powers to arrest suspects, conduct summary trials, lock up political prisoners, and execute people who were considered to be enemies of the state. The Cheka, by the way, was the precursor to the KGB. Here's an interesting quote. Make no mistake, the radical leftists calling for an end to police or their defunding are not seeking a police-less state. So they're not looking to get rid of the police for the state. They just want their police in power to push their hard left PC agendas and to keep all recalcitrants in check. That is their goal. This is a replay of something that the Weathermen had attempted back in the 60s, or the Weather Underground's Prairie Fire movement. Former FBI Deputy Counterterror Director Terry Turchie stated that Antifa and the Defund the Police crowd are running the old radical playbook, the Weather Underground's Prairie Fire. Prairie Fire listed 6 main points to bring down the U.S. government. One point was to push police racism. What Turchie said was this: it is the issue that communist societies use to literally tear apart Americans and to be divisive. And for obvious reasons, we have in our history slavery. Now, the vast majority of people who live in America today do not even have ancestors who lived in America when slavery existed here. Most of us are immigrants who came later than that. Nonetheless, there is a national sense of guilt that comes out and gets stroked and stoked by these claims, and police racism gets a responsive chord. Counterterrorism expert John Guandolo exposed the coordinated effort behind the riots and the Marxist communist origins of Black Lives Matter. Project Veritas, more recently, in fact, just within the past week, has released another Antifa undercover video. And here is what one of the Antifa soldiers said: "We believe in the complete abolition of the system itself, including police." Mobs in the streets. Some are there as peaceful protesters, there's no question. There are pastors there, there are others, there are committed Christians there who have protested because clearly this murder was wrong and everyone would like to see justice done. But there are those who are there to create mayhem. There are some who are there just to steal, to loot, get whatever they want. Well, the net result in these so-called protests after the death of one man, and it was certainly clearly a murder, is now there are 15 people dead and probably more because that was as of June 5th. There are 300 people hospitalized and probably now more. And this has all been led by Black Lives Matter and Antifa. Have you wondered who Black Lives Matter is? Well, it was founded by three women, one of whom describes herself as queer: Patrice Khan-Cullors, Opal Tometi, and Alicia Garcia. Now, this is interesting. On their website, and you can pull up the website, and I suggest that you do it. It's blacklivesmatter.com. It will curl your toes, and you will see this has nothing to do with black men whatsoever. If anything, it's putting down black men. In fact, the section of the website that might otherwise have been called history, they call her story. And here is just a small section from that. Quote, "Black liberation movements in this country have created room, space, and leadership mostly for Black heterosexual, cisgender, meaning straight, non-homosexual men, leaving women, queer, and transgender people and others either out of the movement or in the background to move the work forward with little or no recognition. As a network, we have always recognized the need to center the leadership of women and queer and trans people." That's the leadership of Black Lives Matter. And you see their goal is really, to some degree, they're upset with the black men. We particularly highlighted the egregious ways in which black women, specifically black trans women, that is, black trans women, are violated. blacklivesmatter.com, what we believe. So there's another section of the website, and I've just excerpted a couple of paragraphs. "We make space for transgender brothers and sisters to participate and lead. We are self-reflexive and do the work required to dismantle cisgender privilege." I'll pause there for a moment. It's not saying white privilege. It's saying the privilege of people who are not homosexual or transgender, cisgender privilege. And we uplift black trans folk, especially black trans women, who continue to be disproportionately impacted by trans antagonistic violence. We build a space that affirms black women, no, not black men, and is free from sexism, misogyny, and environments in which men are centered. Okay, so they're trying to not merely fight against whites or non-blacks. Their desire is to take power away from black men as well. And then they say this, and notice what they call their compatriots. "We engage comrades with the intent to learn about and connect with their contexts." And then what they're attempting to do, they say, is we foster a queer affirming network. When we gather, we do so with the intention of freeing ourselves from the tight grip of heteronormative thinking. In other words, you are your biological sex, and that the norm is to be heterosexual. And then they say, or rather the belief that all in the world are heterosexual unless she or he or they disclose otherwise. And then note this, and this is important, it's underlined and I put it in bold. "We disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure." I'll read that again. We disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages that collectively care for one another, especially our children, to the degree that mothers, parents, and children are comfortable. Note they do not mention fathers. And note that straight black men and fathers are never mentioned as a priority anywhere on their website. Black mothers and trans black men, and this is their quote, black mothers and trans black men are. A trans man, by the way, is a biological female. So, who is Antifa or Antifa? Antifa is short for anti-fascistisch, fascist in German, and I've probably destroyed the pronunciation of that in German. But the roots are in Germany and Italy in the 30s and 40s, fighting against Benito Mussolini first, and then Adolf Hitler. And then it expanded in England in the mid 20th century as punk rockers were responding to neo-Nazi skinheads who had gotten involved in the punk movement. Note, by the way, that the sticker, and that's actually a blown-up sticker from Antifa on the right, that it says abolish capitalism. Because if you're a capitalist, they would consider that to be fascism. Anti-fascist action, and then smash fascism. In the late 80s, this is a quote, left-wing punk fans in the United States began following suit, just as the punk rockers in England had, though they initially called their groups Anti-Racist Action, ARA, on the theory that Americans would be more familiar with fighting racism than they would be with fighting fascism. Antifa is anarchist. The Anti-Defamation League says this: Antifa, or most Antifa, come from the anarchist movement or from the far left, though since the 2016 presidential election, some people with more mainstream political backgrounds have also joined their ranks. And then Antifa's political leanings are often described as far left. ABC News reported this: experts say members' radical views vary and can intersect with communism, socialism, and anarchism. It's a very well-organized group. Here is a quote from the Spokane County Sheriff. There is a ton of these Mercedes transport vans with European license plates headed to Spokane right now. And what is going on? Call police, someone replied. The post about the mysterious vans came after a night of looting by a small number of protesters in the city of Spokane, Washington. A Nike store was ransacked, the windows of a local bank were shattered, several small businesses were vandalized. And I'm sorry, this is the quote from the sheriff. This is not our African-American community. This is a group of Antifa socialists who have hijacked this movement, and it's sad. That's Spokane County Sheriff Ozzie Knesovich. And then he continued on, I can tell you that they came in 3 vehicles. They were wearing communication headsets, and it was coordinated. Others have described it as being a military operation when they come in with stacks of bricks being delivered, crowbars being delivered, various other supplies contained in vans and trucks. Inside Antifa, what you find is that they teach violence and vicious tactics, such as eye gouging. It's structured according to Project Veritas, almost like a company. They have a large number of undercover videos. If you haven't seen any of them, I suggest you take a look and make the decision for yourself if this is what's really going on inside Antifa. Their goal is to incite violence, destroy enemies while remaining anonymous. And so they try very hard to stay in the background, to control and direct others, not necessarily to be in the forefront. The undercover journalist said Antifa encourages members to dress in black bloc, which is a way of dressing that helps conceal the identity of members. The whole goal of this, that's where they cover their face, they dress all in black. The whole goal of this is to get out there and do dangerous things as safely as possible. A member is heard on one of the videos telling the group. And he says, practice things like an eye gouge. It takes very little pressure to injure someone's eyes. Consider like destroying your enemy, not like delivering a really awesome right hand, right eye, left eye blow, you know? It's not boxing, it's not kickboxing, boxing. It's like, this is destroying your enemy. Well, when you take a look at the big picture of what is occurring, it is extremely concerning. You know, the newspaper reports and the rest in and of themselves are horrible. But consider this from Arnold Toynbee. Civilizations die from suicide, not murder. He, in his 12-volume work, A Study of History, he concludes of the 22 civilizations that have appeared in history, 19 of them collapsed when they reached the moral state the United States is in right now. Now, he wrote that in 1959, 1960. A lot of time has passed, and we would look back and say, that was a pretty moral country back then compared to now. Will Durant, who had put together a huge compendium studying history, and he called it The Story of Civilization. And he was an American historian who lived between 1885 and 1981. So he lived to a ripe old age. And he said this. He said, a great civilization is not conquered from without until it has destroyed itself within. The essential causes of Rome's decline lay in her people, her morals, her class struggle, her failing trade, her bureaucratic despotism, her stifling taxes, her consuming wars. Edward Gibbon wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Well, he does not lay out carefully a list anywhere. He does identify at various points the major trends that led to the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And at their root, it was this decline in morals, and then corruption at all levels of society, and then the breakdown of marriage, the breakdown of the nuclear family, if you will. You wound up, of course, with a dramatically reduced birth rate, depopulation. They couldn't staff their own military. They hired mercenaries to fight their wars, and eventually they were powerless to fend off the invaders, and it collapsed. The life cycle of a nation is laid out by Lord Macaulay, who was an English writer and historian. This is from a letter that he wrote to an American friend in 1857. And he said that the average age of the world's greatest democratic nations has been 200 years. Each has been through the following sequence: from bondage to spiritual faith, from faith to great courage, from courage to liberty, from liberty to abundance. So far, you can see the background of America, how America grew and got to abundance. And then from abundance, to complacency, from complacency then to selfishness. The me generation, perhaps you've heard it called that, from selfishness to apathy, from apathy to dependency, and from dependency back again into bondage. Now that was 1857. Are there people who are dependent? Well, we have a large dependent class. A great percentage of our people are dependent on payments from the United States government. Even getting through this last crisis, many of us, or many, dropped into dependency. So where is the United States on this timeline? Well, if we go back not that far, Alexis de Tocqueville did it in the 1800s, a careful study, traveled throughout America to find out what the source of its greatness was. You have undoubtedly seen this quote before. I want to share it again. I sought for the greatness and genius of America in her commodious harbors, her ample rivers, and it was not there. In her fertile fields and boundless forests, it was not there. In her rich mines and her vast world commerce, it was not there. In her democratic Congress and her matchless Constitution, and it was not there. Not until I went into the churches of America and heard her pulpits aflame with righteousness did I understand the secret of her genius and power. America is great because she is good. And if America ever ceases to be good, she will cease to be great. Much more recently, in the last century, Alexander Solzhenitsyn stated what he believed was the underlying problem in America. And it was very simple, but very profound. It is because we have forgotten God. That is why all this is happening to us. In God we trust is our national motto and continues to be so. But Will Durant offered this insight. There is no significant example in history before our time of a society successfully maintaining moral life without the aid of religion. John Witherspoon said this: there is not a single instance in history in which civil liberty was lost and religious liberty preserved entire. If therefore we yield up our temporal property, our earthly property, we at the same time deliver the conscience into bondage. He said that in 1776. George Washington, in his farewell address, gave a warning to future generations. And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. And you have undoubtedly noticed that there are many people here in the United States of America, even amongst our leaders, who would like to change massively the Constitution. James Madison said this: we have staked the whole future of American civilization not on the power of government, far from it. We have staked the future of all of our political institutions upon the capacity of mankind for self-government, upon the capacity of each and all of us to govern ourselves, to control ourselves according to the Ten Commandments of God. Hence, they plastered the Ten Commandments everywhere to help in the formation of conscience amongst the children, so that it would not require police to keep them from stealing, to keep them from murdering, to keep them from all of the other crimes that break down a society. But what happens when you get to the me generation, where the Ten Commandments don't have the same import that they once did? Well, Patrick Henry said this. He said, it cannot be emphasized too strongly or too often that this great nation was founded not by religionists, but by Christians, not on religions, but on the gospel of Jesus Christ. For this very reason, peoples of other faiths have been afforded asylum, prosperity, and freedom of worship here. Righteousness alone can exalt a nation. Whoever you are, remember this. Proverbs, we read, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin condemns any people. Patrick Henry, you remember, he's the man who said, give me liberty or give me death. Well, what happens if the church dies? If Christianity goes, T.S. Eliot wrote this in 1948. If Christianity goes, the whole of our culture goes. Then you must start painfully again, and you cannot put on a new culture ready-made. You must wait for the grass to grow to feed the sheep, to give the wool out of which your new coat will be made. You must pass through many centuries of barbarism. We should not live to see the new culture, nor would our great-great-great-grandchildren. And if we did, not one of us would be happy in it. Well, of course, we're dealing now with fake news, which is very key to this change. Edmund Burke, back in 1784, said this: the people never give up their liberties, but under some delusion. Abraham Lincoln said, our government rests in public opinion. Whoever can change public opinion can change the government practically so much. And so what we see is people using the means of communication to foster a very different picture. In many cases, outright lies. In some cases, a shading of the truth. In some cases, editing out portions of what one person or another has said. And now we're on the verge of deep fakes where you can actually have someone appear to be speaking and say something, literally putting words in their mouth and making it look as if this came from their heart. Well, collapse can happen overnight. We saw part of New York City collapse in a few hours. We saw the impact that had on our nation. And at that point, everyone drew together, linked arms, and sang, "God bless America," which is a prayer, begging God's blessing. And we have seen in the last 20 years incredible blessing. And now we're seeing great challenge. Will Durant also said this: from barbarism to civilization requires a century. From civilization to barbarism needs but a day. Abraham Lincoln said, it takes a lot of work or a lot of effort to build a barn, but any jackass can kick it down. We have to rebuild the foundations. Psalm 11 says, if the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? And I would suggest to you that this is not an easy job to go back, but this nation has a foundation. And we cannot be onlookers observing its collapse, because that is what is happening. We need to preserve what is good, and we need to resist the anarchists who would take it away from us. And we cannot be silent. Dry bones can live again. Ezekiel talks about that. Some nations have come back from the brink. In Assyria, God told them that they would be destroyed unless they repented. God sent Jonah, who was a very reluctant prophet, but they repented. Israel, years ago, in the time of Hezekiah, Sennacherib surrounded Jerusalem for months and fully expected to destroy Israel as he had other nations. And then miraculously, God intervened. Hezekiah prayed to God, and God intervened. God relented, and Sennacherib failed because of divine intervention. And when he got back home, he was murdered. And there were no more attempts by him to destroy Israel. In 18th century England, you had the gin craze. It was a horrible time. There had been a tax put on whiskey. People then started to build their own stills to make gin in their own homes. And by the time you got to the 1730s, every fifth or sixth house was a gin mill. Public drunkenness was a real problem. Infants were being born drunk and addicted to alcohol. You wound up with an incredible amount of crime. Life was worth very little. From the leadership to the poorest of the poor, there was very little faith in God. And then you had the Great Awakening, one man who changed everything. There are these points at which choices are offered. God spoke through Moses just before they headed into the land of Israel, to give them a choice as to what they were going to do and how they were going to live and what they needed to do in order to stay in the land and to prosper. And he said this day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life, so that you and your children may live, and that you may love the Lord your God, listen to his voice, and hold fast to him. For the Lord is your life, and he will give you many years in the land he swore to give to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So we are now at a point where it's a time to choose. We've become, to a large degree, a nation of spectators. It's easy to browse on the internet. It's easy to watch TV. Screen time for most people these days ranges from 2 to 5 hours a day. For some, significantly more than that. In his Inferno, Dante remarked that the hottest level in hell is reserved for those who remain neutral in a moral crisis. We are in a moral crisis. We have been in a moral crisis. It is getting worse. It is getting much worse. It is now in the streets. And it's reasonable then to say but I'm just one person. What difference can I make? These problems are too big. I'm only one, Edward Everett Hale said, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something. I will not refuse to do the something that I can do. Edmund Burke wrote, "Nobody makes a greater mistake than he who did nothing because he could only do a little." Arnold Toynbee said, "Sooner or later, man has always had to decide whether he worships his own power or the power of God. One man linked arms with God is a majority." George Whitefield was 22 years old, saved 4 years. He was 4 years as a believer. He had been brought up in a tavern, the most popular business of that day, by the way. And he didn't come from a household of faith. And he pretty much had to beg just to get the training that he needed to be able to preach. A 22-year-old man changed the world. One guy changed the world. And then he had 2 others who wound up helping him. So we might say 3, John and Charles Wesley. They followed after him. I don't know the form that it takes, but one man can change everything. One woman can change everything. Joshua said, "Choose you this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." What does that mean? What does it look like in our lives today? We need to be grappling with that because things are going on that will destroy this nation in the very near term. Are we on the eve of something big? I think there's a good likelihood that we are. Hopefully, it's something good. But when you look at the pattern of nations, if you look at the pattern of history, if you see how God withdraws his restraining hand, it may not be so good. We need to pray. Charles Dickens said, talking about the French Revolution, the eve of the French Revolution, that it was much like today. You know, the stock market, NASDAQ hit 10,000 yesterday. It's all-time high. In this past year, we have seen the lowest unemployment rate amongst many groups ever. We've seen the highest unemployment rate. We have seen the market zoom upwards to new records on the Dow, NASDAQ, Standard & Poor indexes. And then we've seen it plunge in one day more than it ever has in history. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. The opening paragraphs to Charles Dickens' book, A Tale of Two Cities, describing what it was like just before the great French Revolution. Great in that it was big. There were a lot of bad things that came out of that revolution, sadly. Art Buchwald, a columnist who died a few years back, said this: "Whether these are the best of times or worst of times really doesn't matter. These are the only times we have. These are our times." Okay, we couldn't choose when we would be born, just as we don't choose when we're going to die. These are our times. They've been great times. I believe that I have grown up in the golden age of America. When I went to school in the 50s and early 60s, it was fantastic. I would think that the vast majority of the population that ever lived would have traded places with me in a heartbeat. We were not wealthy by any means. We were relatively poor, but we had a great life. And we had safety, and we had freedom, and we had very little, if any, fear. Things have changed. We have this great technology that can be used for good or for evil and amplifies both. These are our times. We need to choose life for our nation. We read in 2 Chronicles 7:14, a verse that some of you may well have memorized. When I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or I command locusts to devour the land, or send COVID among my people. Oh, wait, it says send a plague. Wow, a worldwide plague among my people. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and will heal their land. Now my eyes will be open, my ears attentive to the prayers offered in this place. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray. Note that it is a reversal of fortune that begins in the church, that the foundations are relaid in the hearts of Christians first, in the hearts of those who trust God first. And if you look at the history of the past century and a half, the church has been in a mess. Now, there have been some wonderful ministries, wonderful churches. There have been periods of time where many people have trusted Christ. There have been wonderful things done in the name of Jesus. But the organized church has pretty much fallen apart. You've seen so many churches that have embraced formally this fallen culture. And it's been a cancer that has affected even churches that you would have thought would have resisted it. So we're called to humble ourselves. The word humble there typically refers to fasting and praying and seeking his face. And so as one person, a person praying, the prayers of a righteous man availeth much, the scriptures say. If a man or a woman decides to pray, that prayer can change things. Andrew Murray said, prayer is the power that moves the hand of God. We desperately need to have God's restraining hand back. We desperately need his hand involved in our culture. It will not happen because one person or another works hard, or even a large group works hard. It will only happen with the power of God. I would suggest that we need to pray and determine, what do we do? What action do we take? There is a turning point in this nation, and things seem very out of control, but others seem to be completely in control of it. And some of their efforts are specifically intended to make us feel that we have no control. If just the evangelicals all voted, we would have a different government.